Hello, everybody. Well, it was a heated Prime Minister's question time on Wednesday. It usually is. So they always have a bit of knockabout on Wednesdays. And anyway, was it last week, a few days ago, that Kemi Badenoch was talking about a contentious judicial ruling regarding asylum, and she brought it up. And this is when the Prime Minister is quizzed by various people, but a few questions to go to the leader of His Majesty's Loyal Opposition, which is Kemi Badenoch at the moment. And so she castigated a judge's ruling which gave asylum to to a Palestinian family. Now, the Palestinian family, they applied through a scheme which was intended for Ukrainians, but nevertheless they got asylum on other grounds. Now, here Sir Keir Starmer concurred with what Mrs. Badenoch said, saying that it's for Parliament to make the rules, not the judges. So that's it. The legislative role is to frame the law, whereas judges interpret it. But the tricky thing is this heated debate about statutory interpretation. There's the golden rule, the mischief rule, and I can't remember what the other one is. Can judges make law or not? I know a very distinguished Conservative barrister, Lord Charlie Banner, King's Counsel, and he says that they can make law, but within certain parameters, they can't go too far. So it's disputable whether they can make law or the other one. Oh yeah, the literal rule. That was the other rule, this type of statutory interpretation. You go by the words in the plain and ordinary sense of their signification. The mischief one is saying, well, what mischief was this intended to remedy? And we'll interpret it in the light of that one. Okay, so did the judge go too far? So the highest judge in the civil division, Lady Chief Justice Baroness Sue Carr, has stepped in and she has criticised Mrs. Badenoch for the unacceptability of her comments, and she reminded politicians of their statutory duty to defend the rule of law and not to intrude on the independence of the judiciary. Um, right? Well, everybody would know that, but that was actually put into law with the Constitutional Reform Act. Before that, it was a convention, and that's why politicians have usually refrained from criticizing a decision. But actually, Sir Keir Starmer criticized it himself. Now, he was the head of the Crown Prosecution Service. That's the barristers having to argue that people are guilty in court. So I think that such a distinguished barrister as him would know something about this. So did Mrs. Badenoch go too far? If so, Sir Keir is equally guilty, but he doesn't have the excuse of ignorance, which perhaps she does. Or she's actually got a law degree too. So there was an immigration judge, how he dealt with this family, and the judge ruled in their favor. It was not the intendment of Parliament. This would be for anybody other than Ukrainians, and said that this law decision shouldn't be allowed to stand. I suppose we can have legislation which would overrule certain judicial decisions, but at the moment, the executive, the legislature is powerless. They must uphold the law as decided by judges. And if that is very inconvenient for a political party, tough. They have to do it anyway. So that's why judges make these rulings without fear, without favor. But what happened in the end is that this family, which are the two parents, their four children, they were given permission to live in the United Kingdom with a relative of theirs who's a British citizen, and that man is going to provide them with accommodation needs, and there'll be no cost to the taxpayer. So they are actually in danger of Hamas because they're known opponents of Hamas. So that's why they've been admitted in the United Kingdom, and their house has been destroyed by Israeli bombs. So they want permission to stay in the United Kingdom under different human rights grounds, not under the Ukraine scheme. They'd erroneously applied under that one. But I follow what Craig Murray says, formerly His Majesty's ambassador, Her Majesty's ambassador was in those days to Uzbekistan, 2002 to 2004, back in the dark days of the Karimov tyranny, perhaps the cruelest tyrant in the former Soviet Union. And he had the unenviable task of trying to get this guy to improve his human rights record when the Blair administration was always making excuses for it. Anyhow, and he said, well, why on earth shouldn't Palestinians be allowed to come to the United Kingdom or anywhere else to seek asylum? Because what they're facing is death on an even greater scale than the Ukrainians are facing. If Ukrainians are granted asylum in the UK, then a fortiori this must be extended to Palestinians. So like 50,000 Palestinians have been killed out of a population of only 2.5 million in Gaza. And, it's like 10,000, maybe 20,000 out of a population of like about 30 million who are left there. Precise, but a lot of that's precisely because they've been allowed to leave. And some of the death rained on the Palestinians is with British-made munitions. So it's staggering. You say the hypocrisy. Is it because they're slightly dark-skinned? Is it because 95% of them are Muslim, and so on? So he's got a strong case there. So the double standards here, the injustice of this is flagrant, but nevertheless, Parliament is allowed to do this. That is their intention. This is uniquely for Ukraine, which the United Kingdom is trying to defend, which is an ally of the UK. Anyway, so there was some misunderstanding about this. This situation with the Palestinian family was deliberately misrepresented. So remember, there's a statutory duty not to intrude on the judicial sphere, and that's why politicians, even as vile as that race-baiting demagogue Diane Abbott, she has fought shy of wading into rows about the judiciary and denouncing the ruling of a court. I remember when Andrew Duggan was lawfully killed by the police because they believed it was the way to murder someone. She said that politicians must desist from publicly criticizing the rulings of courts. And that was actually a jury, methinks, rather than a judge who did it. So perhaps the only time I've ever had respect for her. Now, I'm criticizing judicial decision, but I'm not a politician. Um, I can see a certain logic to it, and obviously I haven't read the legislation. I know a learned judge will know far more about it than I do, but even if I were well informed, I might come to the opposite. I might come to the opposite ruling. And so it goes on. So, and apparently the decision in this matter was actually taken when the Conservatives were in office. Yet everybody knows that Parliament makes the rules about this, and sometimes there might be legal loopholes which are closed. So there are these immigration or asylum tribunals, which are like quasi-judicial. The people who present the evidence are not necessarily barristers and solicitors. So it's rare for judges to say anything on the political sphere, but Baroness Carr presumably felt obliged to say something to defend the reputation of the judiciary, and she thinks it's actually quite worrisome and perilous if people are politicians are publicly denouncing judicial rulings. Some judges might cave into such pressure, and they mustn't. But if they're not willing to face up to the scrutiny, that's different. Now, the press has often been very disrespectful about judicial rulings, as is their wont, as is their right. But judges have just carried on regardless and done right, despite this demagoguery, much of which is actually very ill-informed. It seems that Mrs. Badenoch wasn't fully apprised of the facts of the law. Perhaps she ought to have educated herself on that. So judges are public servants, and they're meant to insulate themselves from public opinion, not try to provoke it and not trying to go along with it, but just do the best, irregardless of the popularity or unpopularity of their decisions. So that's what's happened in this case. And what little I know of it, I mean, it seems to be, well, wrong if it was on the Ukraine scheme, but that was a misapprehension. It wasn't under the Ukraine scheme. You can see quite strong human rights provisions. But even Keir Starmer said, there are tens of millions of people around the world who need asylum. The United Kingdom cannot accommodate them all, and actually it accommodates an awful lot in proportion to the population. I know some countries who can scarcely cope, like Syria, Jordan, sorry, not Syria, Turkey, Jordan, Pakistan. They can accommodate an awful lot. I suppose one thing the United Kingdom do could pay these countries to take more people, but that's a bit like the Rwanda scheme. Thank you for watching my video. Goodbye.